Now aforetime in the isle of Numenor the weather was ever apt to the needs and liking of men, rain in due season and ever in measure, and sunshine now warmer, now cooler, and winds from the sea. And when the wind was in the west, it seemed to many that it was filled with a fragrance, fleeting but sweet, heart-stirring, as of flowers that bloom forever in undying meads, and have no names on mortal shores. But all this was now changed, for the sky itself was darkened, and there were storms of rain and hail in those days, and violent winds, and ever and anon a great ship of the Numenorians would founder and return not to haven, though such a grief had not till then befallen them since the rising of the star. And out of the west there would come at times a great cloud in the evening, shaped as it were an eagle, with pinions spread to the north and the south, and slowly it would loom up, blotting out the sunset. And then uttermost night would fall upon Numenor, and some of the eagles bore lightning beneath their wings, and thunder echoed between sea and cloud. Then men grew afraid. "Behold the eagles of the lords of the west," they cried. "The eagles of Manwë are come upon Numenor." And they fell upon their faces. Then some few would repent for a season, but others hardened their hearts, and they shook their fists at heaven, saying, "The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first. The next blow shall be ours." These words the king himself spoke, but they were devised by Sauron. Now the lightnings increased and slew men upon the hills and in the fields and in the streets of the city. And a fiery bolt smote the dome of the temple and shore it asunder, and it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was unshaken, and Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle and defied the lightning and was unharmed. And in that hour men called him a god and did all that he would. When therefore the last portent came, they heeded it little. For the land shook under them, and a groaning as of thunder underground was mingled with the roaring of the sea, and smoke issued from the peak of the Meneltama. But all the more did Ar-Pharazôn press on with his armament. In that time the fleets of the Numenorians darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon the mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were golden and black. And all things waited upon the word of Ar-Pharazôn, and Sauron withdrew into the inmost circle of the temple, and men brought him victims to be burned. Then the eagles of the lords of the west came up out of the dayfall, and they were arrayed as for battle, advancing in a line the end of which diminished beyond sight. And as they came, their wings spread ever wider, grasping the sky, but the west burned red behind them, and they glowed beneath as though they were lit with a flame of great anger, so that all Numenor was illumined as with a smouldering fire. And men looked upon the faces of their fellows, and it seemed to them that they were red with wrath. Then Ar-Pharazôn hardened his heart, and he went aboard his mighty ship, Alcarondus, Castle of the Sea. Many-oared it was, and many-masted, golden and sable. And upon it the throne of Ar-Pharazôn was set. Then he did on his panoply and his crown, and let raise his standard, and he gave the signal for the raising of the anchors. And in that hour the trumpets of Numenor outrang the thunder. Thus the fleets of the Numenorians moved against the menace of the west. And there was little wind, but they had many oars, and many strong slaves to row beneath the lash. The sun went down, and there came a great silence. Darkness fell upon the land, and the sea was still, while the world waited for what I should betide. Slowly the fleets passed out of the sight of the watchers in the havens, and their lights faded, and night took them, and in the morning they were gone. For a wind arose in the east, and it wafted them away, and they broke the ban of the Valar, and sailed into forbidden seas, going up with war against the deathless, to wrest from them everlasting life within the circles of the world. But the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn came up out of the deeps of the sea, and encompassed Avalon and all the isle of Erisir, and the elder mourned, for the light of the setting sun was cut off by the cloud of the Numenorians. And at last our Pharazôn came even to Aman, the blessed realm, and the coasts of Valinor, and still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For our Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores, and saw Taniketu shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Iluvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if none should do battle for it. And a host of the Numenorians encamped in might about Tuna, whence all the Eldar had fled. Then Manwë, upon the mountain, called upon Iluvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Iluvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world. And a great chasm opened in the sea between Numenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken, and all the fleets of the Numenorians were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But our Pharazôn the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten until the last battle and the day of doom. But the land of Aman and Erisea of the Eldar were taken away and removed beyond the reach of men forever. And Andor, the land of Gift, Numenor of the kings, Elena of the star of Erendil, was utterly destroyed. For it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness, and is no more. And there is not now upon earth any place abiding where the memory of a time without evil is preserved. For Iluvatar cast back the great seas west of Middle-earth, and the empty lands east of it, and new lands and new seas were made, and the world was diminished, for Valinor and Erisea were taken from it into the realm of hidden things. In an hour unlooked for by men this doom befell on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then suddenly fire burst from the Meneltama, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid. And Numenor went down into the sea, with all its children, and its wives, and its maidens, and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its law. They vanished forever. And last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tar Miriel the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of the Meneltama to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost in the roaring of the wind. But whether or no it were that Amandil came indeed to Valinor, and Manwë hearkened to his prayer, by grace of the Valar, Elendil and his sons and their people were spared from the ruin of that day. For Elendil had remained in Rhomenna, refusing the summons of the king when he set forth to war, and avoiding the soldiers of Sauron that came to seize him and drag him to the fires of the temple. He went aboard his ship and stood off from the shore, waiting on the time. There he was protected by the land from the great draught of the sea that drew all towards the abyss, and afterwards he was sheltered from the first fury of the storm. But when the devouring wave rolled over the land and Numenor toppled to its fall, then he would have been overwhelmed, and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish. For no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and agony of that day. But the great wind took him wilder than any wind that men had known, roaring from the west, and it swept his ships far away, and it rent their sails and snapped their masts, hunting the unhappy men like straws upon the water. 9 ships there were, 4 for Elendil, and for Isildur 3, and for Anarion 2, and they fled before the black gale out of the twilight of doom into the darkness of the world. And the deeps rose beneath them in towering anger, and waves like unto mountains moving with great caps of writhen snow bore them up amid the wreckage of the clouds, and after many days cast them away upon the shore of Middle-earth. and all the coasts and seaward regions of the western world suffered great change and ruin in that time. For the seas invaded the lands, and shores foundered, and ancient isles were drowned, and new isles were uplifted, and hills crumbled, and rivers were turned into strange courses. Elendil and his sons after founded kingdoms in Middle-earth, and though their lore and craft was but an echo of that which had been ere Sauron came to Numenor, yet very great it seemed to the wild men of the world. And much is said in other lore of the deeds of the heirs of Elendil in the age that came after, and of their strife with Sauron that not yet was ended. For Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Numenorians and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle. And again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm. And a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would do now in the world. Being rid of the Edain forever, he was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there dark and silent until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible, and the eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure. But these things come not into the tale of the drowning of Numenor, of which now all is told. And even the name of that land perished, and men spoke thereafter not of Elena, nor of Andor the gift that was taken away, nor of Numenor on the confines of the world. Among the exiles, many believed that the summit of the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, was not drowned forever, but rose again above the waves, a lonely island lost in the great waters. For it had been a hallowed place, and even in the days of Sauron none had defiled it, and some there were of the seed of Erendil that afterwards sought for it, because it was said among lawmasters that the far-sighted men of old could see from the Meneltarma a glimmer of the deathless land. For even after the ruin, the hearts of the Dunedain were still set westwards. And though they knew indeed that the world was changed, they said, Avalon is vanished from the earth, and the land of Aman is taken away, and in the world of this present darkness it cannot be found. Yet once they were, and therefore they still are, in true being and in the whole shape of the world as at first it was devised. For the Dunedain held that even mortal men, if so blessed, might look upon other times than those of their body's life, and they longed ever to escape from the shadows of their exile, and to see in some fashion the light that dies not, for the sorrow of the thought of death had pursued them over the deeps of the sea. Thus it was that great mariners among them would still search the empty seas, hoping to come upon the isle of Meneltarma, and there to see a vision of things that were. But they found it not, and those that sailed far came only to the new lands, and found them like to the old lands, and subject to death. And those that sailed furthest set but a girdle about the earth, and returned weary at last to the place of their beginning, and they said, All roads are now bent. Thus, in after days, what by the voyages of ships, what by lore and starcraft, the kings of men knew that the world was indeed made round, and yet the Eldar were permitted still to depart and to come to the ancient west and to Avalon if they would. Therefore the lore-masters of men said that a straight road must still be for those that were permitted to find it. And they taught that while the new world fell away, the old road and the path of the memory of the west still went on, as it were a mighty bridge invisible that passed through the air of breath and of flight, which were bent now as the world was bent, and traversed ill men which flesh unaided cannot endure, until it came to Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, and maybe even beyond to Valinor, where the Valar still dwell and watch the unfolding of the story of the world. And tales and rumours arose along the shores of the sea concerning mariners and men forlorn upon the water, who by some fate or grace or favour of the Valar had entered in upon the straight way and seen the face of the world sink below them, and so had come to the lamplit keys of Avalon, or verily to the last beaches on the margin of Aman, and there had looked upon the White Mountain, dreadful and beautiful, before they died. Here ends the story of Akalabeth, narrated by AI model using Tolkien's readings in the past. Thank you for watching, or as a wizard once said, may the wind under the wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks